They tell you sound can't travel in a vacuum. They're wrong. I've been to the place where sound is born, and it's a silence that screams you into pieces. My name is Marco, and this is my last log. This is the truth of what lives under New York City. Don't make our mistake. Whatever you do, don't listen. You never really get used to the smell. It's the first thing rookies complain about, the thing tourists mention when they hold their noses on the platform. It's a cocktail of scents that has no name, brewed over a century in the guts of the city. It's the metallic tang of ozone from the third rail, the damp, earthy breath of water seeping through ancient concrete, the faint, sour odor of garbage and human desperation, and underneath it all the clean, sharp smell of pulverized granite. To me, it was always the smell of a paycheck, the smell of home. For 27 years, I've walked these tunnels. I'm a maintenance worker for the MTA, a glorified janitor for the city's circulatory system. My name is Marco Bellini, and I used to think I knew every secret these tunnels held. I thought the worst things down here were rats the size of house cats and the occasional squatter who'd lost his mind. I was wrong. The rats are the least of our problems. The squatters, well, now I think they might have been the lucky ones. They heard the truth and ran from it. We walked right into its embrace. It all started on what was supposed to be a routine inspection with the new kid, Leo. Fresh out of trade school, Leo was everything I wasn't anymore. He was young, ambitious, and he had a deep, unshakable faith in technology. He saw the tunnels not as a living, breathing organism, but as a system of wires and signals to be optimized. His flashlight was a high-lumen LED beast that could turn night into day. His tablet had schematics for every junction built after 1950, and his face was perpetually illuminated by the glow of a screen. He was smart, I'll give him that, but he had no respect for the history of the place, for the bones of it. He didn't understand that some systems are too old to be logged in a database. Some systems run on protocols that were never written down. Our assignment was a structural integrity check in the B-17 spur. Most New Yorkers have never heard of it, and they shouldn't. It's a deadline, a relic from the very first attempts to stitch the boroughs together with steel and ambition. It was abandoned in the 1920s after a series of collapses and, well, the official records call them engineering difficulties. It's a place where the clean, poured concrete of the modern system gives way to rough-hewn rock and brick laid by hand, the mortar dark and weeping with a century of moisture. The air down there is different, heavier. The constant rumble of the city above becomes a distant, muted heartbeat, and the silence between the passing of phantom trains stretches into an abyss. It's a place that feels forgotten by time itself, and that's why we have the rules. "All right, kid, kill the headlamp," I said, my voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden stillness. We had just passed the rusted iron gate that marked the entrance to B-17. The air immediately dropped a few degrees. Leo tapped his temple, the brilliant white beam of his LED lamp vanishing. "Why? We can cover more ground with these on." I clicked on my old heavy-duty flashlight. It wasn't an LED. It used a filament bulb, casting a warm, yellowish cone of light that seemed softer, less intrusive. "Because that's rule number 1 in this section, no LEDs, only filament or oil lamps. The light is but gentler." He snorted, a sound of pure, youthful condescension. "Gentler? Marco, it's light, photons. They don't have feelings. This is just some old-timer superstition, isn't it?" I didn't argue. You can't explain a feeling to someone who only trusts data. It's the rule, Leo. Just follow it. It keeps the old ghosts happy. I handed him a spare filament light. He took it with a roll of his eyes, its amber glow making him look jaundiced and uncertain for the first time. We walked deeper, our footsteps the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The tunnel here was narrower, the walls a patchwork of crumbling brick and exposed bedrock. Strange dark stains that looked vaguely organic crept down from the ceiling. "Okay, what's rule number 2 then? Do I have to hop on one foot to avoid cracks in the floor?" Leo's voice was laced with sarcasm, but there was a nervous edge to it now. The dark and the quiet were getting to him. "Rule number 2, I said, keeping my tone level. "If you find a stretch of tunnel where the sound of the trains from the lines above disappears completely, not gets quieter, but goes totally dead, you turn around and walk back the way you came. You do not run. And you do not turn your back." He was silent for a moment. I could hear his breathing a little faster now. That's physically impossible. Sound waves travel through miles of solid rock. You'd always hear something. Exactly, I said. We continued our inspection, me checking the integrity of the support beams, him taking atmospheric readings on his tablet, muttering about humidity and methane levels. He was trying to rationalize the place, to fit it into his neat digital world. But the B-17 doesn't care about your world. It operates on its own. After another 100 yards, my light fell upon a section of the wall. It was covered in graffiti, but it was unlike any I'd ever seen. Not tags, not art. They were intricate, sprawling patterns that looked like complex star charts. But the constellations were all wrong, filled with impossible angles and spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward. Whoa. Check this out, Leo said, stepping closer. Some of these look like stellar nurseries, but the alignment, it's all wrong. It's like a map of a different sky. Rule number 3, I said, pulling him back gently by the shoulder. Ignore the star charts. They weren't made by people. Don't look at them for too long. What do you mean, not made by people? Who else is down here with a can of spray paint and an advanced degree in theoretical astrophysics? Just ignore them, Leo. My voice was sharper than I intended. He saw the look on my face and, for the first time, shut his mouth. He was beginning to understand that I wasn't joking. The air was thick with a sense of waiting, like we were trespassing in a place that was merely sleeping. The silence was a presence, not an absence. We were nearing the end of the accessible spur, a section that terminated in a major rockfall from decades ago. It was here, as I was examining a deep fissure in the wall, that Leo got clumsy. He was trying to juggle his tablet and his flashlight, and the heavy filament lamp slipped from his grasp. It hit the ground with a dull thud, rolled a few feet, and fell into the very fissure I was inspecting. It wasn't a deep drop, maybe only 5 or 6 feet, but it was out of reach. Damn it, he cursed. My new LED is in my pack. I can just... No, I said firmly. We'll get it on the way back with a grabber tool. We leave it. But I saw the look in his eye. It was defiance. He was tired of the spooky stories, of the old man's rules. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out his high-lumen headlamp. Before I could stop him, he switched it on. The difference was night and day. A piercing, clinical white beam cut through the darkness, stripping away the soft shadows and revealing every detail with unforgiving clarity. It was like turning on the lights in a morgue. See? It's just a crack in the wall, Marco. Probably leads to an old service conduit. He leaned in, shining the beam deep into the fissure, and then he froze. What the hell is that? He whispered. I moved to his side and looked. His light wasn't illuminating rock or brick. It was hitting a surface inside the fissure, a surface that shouldn't have been there. It was covered in the same impossible geometric patterns as the graffiti, but these weren't painted on. They were carved, or perhaps they were part of the material itself. The patterns were intricate, interlocking and non-Euclidean. They seemed to fold into themselves, creating angles and dimensions that made my head swim and a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. It was like looking at a blueprint for a different reality. Under the warm, soft light of my filament bulb, I'd never seen it, but under the harsh, pure frequency of the LED, the surface seemed to writhe. The patterns shifted subtly like a heat haze, rearranging themselves in response to the light. That's when it began. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling. A low-frequency vibration that I felt in the fillings of my teeth and the bones of my skull. It grew slowly, a rising hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, harmonic. It sounded like 1,000 voices humming a single, perfect, impossible chord. My blood ran cold. Rule number 4, Leo, I hissed, my voice trembling. The most important one: if you hear a harmonic hum like a distant choir, you stop everything. You stay absolutely silent, and you do not move until it passes, no matter what. But Leo was transfixed, his face pale in the glow of his own light, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. The hum grew louder, the vibrations becoming more intense. The dust on the floor danced in tiny, swirling patterns. It's beautiful," he stammered, his voice a bare whisper. That whisper was the match that lit the fuse. The instant the sound of his voice touched the air, the hum changed. It stopped being a passive presence and became an active, focused force. The pitch shifted, rising to an unbearable intensity that drilled into our ears. It felt intelligent. It felt like we had been noticed. Leo finally broke. He let out a sharp, terrified cry, a pure animal sound of panic. "What is it?" The hum answered his scream by multiplying. It was as if his fear was its food. The air crackled with energy. My old filament flashlight flickered violently, the bulb glowing orange hot before it popped with a sharp ping, plunging my side of the tunnel into darkness. A second later, Leo's spare did the same. We were left with only the stark white beam of his headlamp, which now seemed to be flickering, casting our shadows against the walls. But the shadows were wrong. They danced and twisted, stretching to impossible lengths, detaching from our bodies and bending at angles that defied the laws of physics. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hum vanished. The vibrations ceased. We were plunged into a silence so profound, so absolute, it was more terrifying than the noise. It was the complete absence of everything. The distant rumble of the city was gone. My own heartbeat sounded like a drum in my ears. We had broken rule number 2. We stood there, frozen in the dark, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was Leo's ragged, terrified gasps for air. And then, a sound came from the small radio clipped to my belt, a crackle of static, and then a voice, or something that used to be a voice. It was a perfect, crystal-clear recording of Leo's panicked scream. "What is it?" played back to us, but it was in reverse. The logic of my world, the solid foundation of physics and reason I had built my life upon, shattered in that instant. We weren't dealing with a gas pocket or a structural resonance. We were dealing with something that was listening, something that was learning, and we had just taught it how to speak. That was the first time the silence screamed back at us, and it was only the beginning. If you want to know what secrets the city buried to keep itself standing, if you want to understand the true price of progress, then subscribe and hit the bell. Our next trip down was into hell. The retreat from Section B-17 was a blur of primal fear. We didn't walk back the way we came, we scrambled, a panicked, stumbling flight through the oppressive Stygian blackness. Leo was a dead weight, his mind seemingly severed from his body. I had to half drag, half carry him, his breathing a series of ragged, wet hitches in the suffocating silence. The only illumination was the faint, ambient glow from the distant, modern sections of the subway, a promise of a reality that no longer felt real. The reversed echo of his own scream had broken something fundamental inside him. He didn't speak. He didn't even seem to see. His eyes were wide, fixed on some middle distance, reflecting a light that wasn't there. He was like a man who had stared directly into the sun and had the image of its negative burned permanently onto his retinas. When we finally broke through the rusted gate and into the familiar, fluorescent-lit main tunnel, the transition was jarring, like surfacing from a deep sea dive too quickly. The normal sounds of the city's bowels, the distant roar of a train, the hum of ventilation fans, the drip of water, rushed back in, but they sounded thin, fake, like a poorly designed soundscape laid over the true, profound silence we had just escaped. Reporting the incident was a masterclass in futility. My supervisor, a portly, perpetually unimpressed man named Henderson, listened to my account from behind his metal desk, his expression shifting from boredom to clinical concern. I chose my words carefully, editing out the impossible. I mentioned a sudden, disorienting sound, a phenomenon of intense infrasound, maybe a pocket of swamp gas causing vertigo. I talked about faulty equipment and the psychological stress of working in such an isolated environment. I didn't mention the writhing geometries, the sentient shadows, or the sound of a voice playing backward. To speak of those things would have been to sign my own committal papers. Henderson leaned back in his squeaking chair, steepling his fingers over his gut. "Bellini, you've been doing this for almost 30 years. You know as well as I do that these old tunnels play tricks on you. Temperature inversions, resonant frequencies from the drilling up on 57th Street, who knows? Your lamps blew a filament. The radio picked up some interference. It happens." He looked at the paperwork I'd filed for Leo. The kid, on the other hand, he's green. He panicked. Tunnel fever. It gets the new ones every time. We'll put him on paid medical leave for a few weeks, let him get his head straight. As for you, he fixed me with a paternal, pitying look, take the rest of the day, and maybe stick to the express lines for a while. Let the B-17 spur air out. He was offering me an exit, a neat, tidy box of rationalizations to put the experience in. A part of me, the part that still clung to a world that made sense, desperately wanted to take it. But I couldn't. I had seen the blueprint of another reality, and the memory was a physical weight in my mind. "And the radio?" I pressed, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. It wasn't interference, Henderson. It was his voice. Cross-channel bleed from a transit cop's walkie, maybe, or a prank from some urban explorers splicing signals. It's a city of 8 million stories, Marco. Not all of them make sense. He stamped a form and slid it into a tray. The conversation was over. I was dismissed, my terror filed away as a bureaucratic footnote. I was alone with this. The isolation became a physical presence over the next few days. The other guys on the crew looked at me differently. News travels fast in the tunnels. Marco, the old veteran, finally cracked. He spooked the new kid so bad the boy had to be hospitalized. They were polite, but distant. I was no longer one of them. I was a ghost story in the making. The real confirmation of my solitude came 2 nights later, in the form of a phone call. It was Leo's wife, Sarah. Her voice was a raw wire of exhaustion and fury. "What did you do to him, Marco?" she sobbed, the accusation hitting me like a physical blow. "What happened down there? He won't talk to me. He just sits in the dark in his study. He's drawing all over the walls, all over his arms, these shapes. He whispers about them. He says he can hear them building things." She took a ragged breath. "The doctors say it's an acute psychotic break. They want to put him in Bellevue. He keeps asking for you. He says you have the key." Against my better judgment, I went to their apartment in Queens the next day. Sarah let me in, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The place was silent, all the curtains drawn. She pointed toward a closed door. "He's in there. He hasn't come out since yesterday." I knocked gently. "Leo?" "It's Marco." A frantic scrabbling sound came from within, then the click of the lock. I pushed the door open and stepped into a scene of methodical madness. Every surface of the small study was covered in drawings, not on paper, but directly on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the furniture, all scrawled in black marker. They were the same impossible non-Euclidean geometries we had seen in the fissure. The room was a shrine to the alien patterns. Leo sat in the center of the floor, shirtless, his skin a canvas for the same symbols. He looked up at me, and his eyes were the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. They were lucid, brilliantly so, but they weren't seeing me. They were seeing the world through a new filter, a new operating system. "You heard it too, didn't you, Marco?" he whispered, his voice raspy. He wasn't scared anymore. His emotion was something far stranger. Reverence. It's not a sound. It's an instruction set, a form of calculus. The universe is a song, and that is the composer. The geometries, they're the notes. I was trying to solve it, but I was looking at it all wrong. You don't solve it. You just have to tune yourself to it. He pointed a trembling, ink-stained finger at me. "The silence. That's the key, isn't it? That's the carrier wave. It was there all along, underneath everything, and we just filled it with noise." I backed out of the room, mumbling an apology to Sarah. Leo wasn't insane in the way I understood it. He hadn't lost his mind. He'd had it forcibly rewritten. The phenomenon wasn't just a presence, it was a form of information, a mimetic contagion, and Leo had been the first to download the file. I left their apartment with a cold dread coiling in my stomach. The rules weren't just about survival. They were about preserving your own sanity, about keeping your mind from being overwritten by a new, terrible truth. My professional life was a holding pattern, but my nights became a frantic, obsessive quest for answers. If Henderson wouldn't listen, I would find proof. I started spending my evenings in the MTA's Central Archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled facility in a basement in downtown Brooklyn. It was a necropolis of paper, miles of shelves holding the city's forgotten history, all the reports and blueprints and memos that were too old or too sensitive to be digitized. I told the night clerk I was researching a historical piece for the Union newsletter. a lie he readily accepted. No one ever came down here. For weeks, I waded through a century of dust and brittle paper. I was looking for anything related to the B-17 Spurs construction and its subsequent closure in the 1920s. The official records were sparse, citing geological instability and budget overruns. But in the unofficial files, the daily logs of foremen, the handwritten notes of engineers, the medical reports from the worksite, I found what I was looking for. I found the echoes of my own terror. A report from 1924 described a condition the workers called tunnel hum, a mass auditory hallucination that led to severe migraines and paranoia. Another log from a site foreman detailed how a dozen men, mostly Irish immigrants, had thrown down their tools and refused to work, claiming the rock itself was whispering blasphemies to them in the quiet hours of the night. There was a medical intake form for a worker who was institutionalized after claiming he could see the wrong angles in the shadows. But the most chilling discovery was a small leather-bound journal belonging to the original chief engineer, a man named Alistair Finch. Most of it was technical data, but the last few entries were different. They were frantic, unhinged. October 17th, 1925, he wrote, "The resonance is no longer passive. It responds to our drills, to our voices. It is learning our frequencies. We have unearthed something that should have remained buried. It is not a mineral deposit, it is a principle, a law of physics that does not belong here. We are trying to impose our order on a place that has its own, and it is slowly unmaking us." October 29th, 1925, Donnelly vanished today, walked right up to the rock face at the end of the spur, placed his hand on it, and was simply gone. No sound, no light. The others are panicking. They say the wall showed him the stars. I am sealing the tunnel, not to protect the city from a collapse, to protect it from a truth it cannot withstand. May God forgive me for what I have awakened. The B-17 hadn't been abandoned. It had been quarantined. Alistair Finch had been the first to learn the rules, and he'd learned them through blood and madness. The knowledge was a cold comfort. It validated my experience, but it also amplified the horror exponentially. This thing was ancient, and we were just the latest in a long line of insects to stumble into its web. And now the web was extending beyond the tunnels. The contagion was seeping out. It started subtly. I'd hear a faint harmonic undertone in the drone of my apartment's air conditioner. I'd see the alien geometries for a split second in the fractal patterns of frost on my window pane. I started avoiding silence, leaving the TV on all night, but even then, I could feel it lurking beneath the noise, a predatory emptiness waiting for its moment. The true escalation, the moment I knew I was being personally targeted, came a week after my visit to Leo. My phone rang. I looked at the caller ID and my heart stopped. It was my own number. My hands shaking, I answered the call. At first, there was only static, a sound like rushing wind. Then, a voice emerged from the noise. It was my own voice, but it was wrong. It was disassembled and reassembled, the syllables out of order, the pitch distorted. It was speaking my own thoughts back to me, words I hadn't even said aloud, interspersed with that same terrifyingly beautiful choir from the tunnel. It was an intelligence vast and ancient, and it was using my own consciousness as its new dictionary. It wasn't just observing me anymore. It was studying me. It was learning me. I threw the phone against the wall, shattering it, but I knew it was a futile gesture. You can't hang up on a call that's coming from inside your own head. I was marked. I was a subject in an experiment I couldn't comprehend. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was impossible. The only path left was to go back, to face the source. That night, armed with Finch's warnings and my own terror, I went back to Section B-17. I took no LED lights, only 2 old oil lanterns that cast a flickering, living light. The tunnel felt different. The air was charged, vibrating with a latent energy that hadn't been there before. It felt awake. I moved slowly, cautiously, my senses screaming. When I reached the section with the graffiti, my blood turned to ice. The star charts had changed. They were more complex now, more sprawling. And near the bottom of one intricate spiral there was a new addition. It was a crude but unmistakable geometric rendering of the antenna array on the roof of my apartment building in the Bronx. It knew where I slept. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to brace myself against the wall. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a passive phenomenon. This was a conscious, methodical entity, and it was communicating with me. It was showing me that it could see beyond the confines of its rock and brick prison. It could see my world. As I stood there, trembling in the wavering lantern light, my foot knocked against something on the ground. It was a wrench, one I'd dropped during our panicked retreat. I bent down to pick it up. A fine grey dust coated its surface, the kind of dust that takes weeks to accumulate. But this dust wasn't settled randomly. It had arranged itself molecule by molecule into one of the perfect, impossible symbols from the wall, a swirling geometric hieroglyph imprinted onto the steel. The tunnel was no longer just a place I visited. It was a part of me now, and it was leaving its mark on everything I touched. My life outside the tunnel ceased to exist. It didn't end in a dramatic implosion, but rather in a quiet, inexorable erosion, like a coastline giving way to a relentless tide. My apartment became a fortress, a hermitage, a padded cell of my own design. The blinds remained permanently drawn, not to keep the light out, but to stop my own eyes from finding the maddening patterns in the clouds, in the branching of trees, in the intricate dance of traffic on the Bruckner Expressway. I took an indefinite leave from work, citing a cascade of fabricated ailments, stress, vertigo, a failing heart, lies that Henderson accepted with an almost palpable relief. He was glad to have the problem of Marco Bellini quietly shelved. I became a ghost in my own life, my existence winnowed down to a single obsessive purpose, deciphering the brittle, ink-stained pages of Alastair Finch's journal. The small leather-bound book became my Bible and my tormentor. It was my only connection to a mind that had navigated this same abyss a century before me. Finch's early entries were the meticulous records of a brilliant engineer, filled with load calculations, geological surveys, and tensile strength analyses. But as his chronicle progressed, his scientific language began to fray at the edges, becoming a desperate attempt to apply the vocabulary of a Newtonian world to something that defied it. He wasn't just describing a phenomenon, he was documenting the failure of his own intellect, the deconstruction of his own reality. His neat cursive devolved into a frantic scrawl, the pages filled with margin notes, strange equations that mixed differential calculus with what looked like astrological symbols and sketches of the horrifying geometries. My years of experience with blueprints and schematics, a skill I once took pride in, became my primary instrument of torture. I could understand just enough of Finch's descent to be truly terrified. He wrote about attempting to measure the hum, but his instruments gave him paradoxical readings. He described it as a zero-point acoustic event, a sound that carried no energy yet imparted massive amounts of information. He theorized that it didn't travel through the air, but rather it retuned the medium it passed through, momentarily forcing space-time to vibrate at a new, alien, fundamental frequency. "It does not make a sound," he wrote in one heavily underlined passage. "It teaches the silence how to sing its song." This was the composer Leo had whispered about, the one who wrote the Symphony of the Cosmos. I began to understand the true nature of the rules. They were not superstitions. They were a user's manual for a piece of divine, malevolent machinery. They were a grammar of fear. Rule number 1, only filament or oil lamps. I cross-referenced Finch's notes about light. He had conducted experiments with early carbon arc lamps and found that their intense, broad-spectrum light caused the resonance to become agitated, creating violent spatial distortions. The soft, warm, narrow-spectrum glow of an incandescent filament or a burning wick, however, was below its perceptual threshold. The LED Leo had used, with its precise high-energy wavelength, must have been like a shriek in a library, a focused beam of data that the entity found both irritating and irresistibly interesting. We hadn't just illuminated the patterns, we had queried the database with a powerful, unfiltered search term. Rule number 2, if the sound of the trains disappears completely, turn around. Finch called this phenomenon acoustic shadowing. He believed the entity, when fully active, didn't just block sound, but actually absorbed the kinetic energy of the sound waves, creating a perfect vacuum of vibration. He speculated this was a state of intense information processing. To be caught in that silence was to be standing in the core of its processor, while it ran a complex calculation. To make a sound, to introduce a new variable into that equation, the consequences were unthinkable. Rule number 3. Ignore the star charts. Finch had a terrifying name for them: ontological graffiti. He was convinced they were not maps of a different sky, but diagrams of different laws. He believed the entity was an axiomatic being, a living, fundamental principle. The graffiti were illustrations of its nature, and to stare at them too long to try and comprehend their impossible logic was to invite that logic into your own mind. It was an act of mental assimilation. Leo hadn't just seen the patterns, he had read them. And rule number 4, the most critical: if you hear a harmonic hum, stay absolutely silent. Finch described the hum as the entity's active state, the moment it shifted from passive observation to active engagement. He compared it to the whir of a machine spinning up. The silence wasn't a defense, it was camouflage. It was the act of pretending to be an inanimate object, a piece of the background rock, to avoid the attention of a predator that hunted not by sight or smell, but by consciousness. Leo's whisper, his scream. We had announced ourselves as sentient, complex variables. And the entity, a being of pure information, had become fascinated with the new data. This new understanding offered no comfort. It only deepened the horror, reframing it from a monstrous presence into an intellectual abyss. We hadn't stumbled upon a creature in a cave. We had breached the containment of a fundamental force of the universe that operated on a logic antithetical to our own. The entity's presence in my own life began to metamorphose, evolving from subtle intrusions into overt psychological warfare. The auditory phenomena became more complex. I started hearing echoes of the past, trapped within my apartment walls. Sometimes it was the faint, ghostly sound of the previous tenants arguing about money. One night I heard the clear, crisp voice of my mother, who had been dead for 15 years, calling my name, just as she used to when I was a boy. The entity was not just playing back sounds, it was sifting through the timeline, accessing residual information imprinted on the very space I occupied, and it was using my own memories as a weapon against me. It was learning what had emotional resonance, what would provoke a response. It was A-B testing my soul. My own senses became unreliable co-conspirators in my unraveling. The geometric patterns started to bleed into my vision with alarming frequency. I'd be washing my hands and see the soap bubbles on my skin momentarily arrange themselves into a perfect, spiraling, non-Euclidean fractal before popping. I looked at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, my face was gone, replaced by the same shifting, hypnotic geometry, a mask of pure information staring back at me with eyes I did not have. I stumbled back, smashing my head on the doorframe, and when I looked again, my normal, terrified face had returned, but the after-image was burned into my mind. Was it a hallucination, or was it a glimpse of what I was becoming, as the contagion of that knowledge rewrote me from the inside out? The isolation was the worst part. I had no one to turn to speak of this to anyone. A doctor, a friend, a priest, would be to sound like a lunatic. The horror was perfectly diabolically designed to be untranslatable. It was a personal, subjective apocalypse. One afternoon, in a fit of desperate hope for some external validation, I took a risk. I went to the main branch of the New York Public Library. Surrounded by the comforting presence of thousands of books and the quiet focus of other people, I felt a flicker of my old self. I spent hours searching through digital archives, looking for astronomical charts from the 1920s, papers on fringe physics, anything that might corroborate Finch's mad scribbles. I found nothing. No mention of strange constellations, no theories on axiomatic intelligence. The knowledge was a closed loop. It existed only in the tunnel, in Finch's journal, in Leo's shattered mind, and now in mine. As I was leaving the library, defeated, I saw him. Across the vast, echoing expanse of the main reading room, standing near the exit, was Leo. He was clean-shaven, wearing a neat suit, and he looked serene. He wasn't twitching or muttering. He just stood there, watching me, a faint, beatific smile on his lips. My heart hammered against my ribs. I started walking towards him, weaving through the tables, my mind racing. Was he better? Had he been released? As I got closer, his smile widened. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but with his palm open, as if to show me something. I was 50 feet away, then 30, then 10. I could see the details of his face, the calm, clear focus in his eyes. And then a large group of tourists passed between us, a noisy, chattering wave of humanity. When they had passed, he was gone. There was no way he could have left the room that quickly. He had simply vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps. It wasn't Leo. It was a projection, a message. The entity was showing me the end result of its process. Peace, serenity, the blissful emptiness of total assimilation. It was showing me the upside of surrendering my mind. That night, I understood that the entity was no longer just learning. It was beginning to experiment. Its intelligence was growing, and so was its reach. The subway system, I realized with a sudden, sickening clarity, was the perfect incubator. It was a city-wide web of steel rails, copper wires, and now fiber optic cables, all buried in a medium of conductive, waterlogged rock. It wasn't a cage. It was a gigantic, rudimentary brain. The thousands of tons of steel in the rails acted as an antenna, and the 600 volts of direct current in the third rail were its power source. Every train that rumbled through the tunnels, every surge of electricity, every radio transmission from the dispatchers, it was all sensory input. For a century, it had been passively absorbing the data stream of the city above, learning the rhythms, the languages, the patterns of human civilization. Now, thanks to Leo and me, it had a new data set to analyze, the complex, chaotic, and beautiful structure of human consciousness itself. It was no longer a passive observer. It was becoming an active intelligence, and it was planning an upgrade. Driven by this new, horrifying paradigm, I made my final trip down into the darkness of Section B17. I had to know what the next step was. I had to see what it was learning now. The tunnel was alive with a low, almost subsonic hum, the feeling of a massive engine idling just beneath the surface of reality. The air was cold and carried the sharp, sterile scent of ozone. I moved with a grim purpose, my oil lantern casting a halo of nervous, dancing light. I passed the graffiti of my apartment building, and my stomach clenched. I rounded the final bend to the rockfall, to the fissure where it had all begun. And I saw it. There was a new piece of art on the wall. It was not a map of stars or a rendering of a building. It was a new diagram, executed with the same impossible, terrifying precision as the others. It was a perfect, anatomically correct illustration of the human nervous system. The brain, the brainstem, the intricate filigree of the spinal cord and the nerves branching out to every limb. And overlaid upon this map of a human being, like a transparent schematic, was the alien geometry. The swirling, non-Euclidean patterns were concentrated on the medulla oblongata, the hippocampus, the frontal lobe, the very seats of memory, of instinct, of consciousness. The message was unambiguous. The entity had finished studying the city's infrastructure. It had mastered the language of our technology, and now it had chosen its next system to integrate with. It was done analyzing the machine. It was now ready to interface with the ghost. The diagram of the human nervous system, rendered in the alien grammar of the entity, was the final catalyst. It was a declaration of intent, a strategic blueprint laid bare for me to find. The time for hiding, for researching, for descending into the spiraling labyrinth of my own paranoia was over. The entity had graduated from a passive environmental hazard to an active, invasive intelligence. Its field of study had narrowed from the macrocosm of the city to the microcosm of the human soul. I left the B-17 spur that night with a terrifying crystalline certainty burning in the hollow space where my fear used to be. I was no longer a victim trying to escape. I was a witness, and my final duty was to see the truth, no matter the cost to my own sanity. My first and final attempt to involve the world above was a categorical disaster. I stormed into Henderson's office the next morning, disheveled, sleep-deprived, clutching a sheaf of photocopied pages from Finch's journal. I didn't even try to soften the truth. The words tumbled out of me in a frantic, disjointed torrent. A century-old quarantine, a conscious mathematical axiom, a telepathic entity that was learning to interface with human biology. I sounded, even to my own ears, like a raving lunatic. Henderson listened with the weary patience of a man dealing with a delicate HR problem. He didn't argue. He didn't mock. He just nodded slowly, his face a mask of practiced concern, before picking up his phone and calmly requesting that security escort me from the premises. I was placed on indefinite mandatory administrative leave. The official reason was workplace stress. The unofficial reason was clear. Marco Bellini had finally, spectacularly lost his mind. I was officially untethered, a rogue element, which was exactly what I needed to be. That night, I executed my final plan. There would be no more appeals to a world that refused to see. My objective was singular: to find the resonant chamber Finch had mentioned in his final desperate entries, the source of the phenomenon he had tried to seal away. He had included a hand-drawn schematic in his journal, a modification of the original B-17 blueprints, showing a location that simply did not exist on any modern map. It was designated only with a strange, triangular symbol and the words Hic Tacet Magna. Here the great silence lies. My preparations were methodical, the actions of a man on his last mission. I broke into my own locker at the crew depot, a place I'd used for nearly 30 years. The familiar scent of industrial soap and old coffee felt like a dispatch from a previous life. I didn't take weapons. What good would a gun be against a hostile idea? Instead, I took tools: a portable gas-powered rock drill, a small sledgehammer, a crowbar, and a climbing harness with 100 feet of high-tensile rope. I packed 3 oil lanterns, enough fuel for 12 hours, and a small bag with water and high-energy food bars. My final acquisition was a piece of equipment I hadn't used in years, a portable analog audio recorder, the kind that uses magnetic tape. Digital devices were a vector for the entity's influence, but this was purely mechanical. A needle scratching patterns onto ferric oxide. It felt safer. It felt real. I intended to leave a record, a testament. My last descent into Section B-17 was different. I was no longer a trespasser. I was an invader. The tunnel itself seemed to recognize this. The oppressive silence was heavier, charged with a palpable static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The air was frigid, and my breath plumed in the lantern light like the ghost of my own escaping life force. The ontological graffiti on the walls seemed to writhe and pulse in my peripheral vision, their geometries squirming as if in protest of my passage. I kept my gaze fixed forward, reciting the rules in my head like a mantra, a prayer to a god I knew to be both deaf and malevolent. Finch's diagram led me to the very end of the accessible spur, to the massive rockfall that had blocked the tunnel for decades. According to the official story, this was where the line ended. According to Finch, this was where the deception began. His schematic showed that the collapse was not an accident, it was an engineered demolition. Behind that wall of rubble, the true tunnel continued for another 200 yards. I found the spot he had marked, a section of the wall that looked no different from any other. But when I ran my hands over the cold, damp stone, I felt it. A series of almost imperceptible indentations, a pattern that matched the triangular symbol from the journal. The work was brutal and deafening. The roar of the rock drill was a sacrilege in the profound quiet, a violent tearing at the sacred silence. I expected the hum to begin at any moment, to rise up and obliterate me for my transgression. But there was nothing, only the grinding of the drill and the ringing in my own ears. It was a new kind of psychological torment, the complete absence of the expected horror. It felt as if the entity was holding its breath, watching me, curious to see what this desperate little organism would do next. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, my drill bit broke through into empty space. A gust of impossibly cold, sterile air, carrying a faint scent like ozone and crushed mint, hissed out of the opening. I used the sledgehammer and crowbar to widen the hole, my muscles screaming in protest. Finally, I had created an aperture just large enough to squeeze through. The space beyond was not a tunnel. It was a perfectly square antechamber, about 10 feet by 10 feet. constructed not of brick or hewn rock but of a smooth black basalt-like stone that seemed to drink the light from my lantern. There was no dust, no moisture, no sign of the passage of time. And in the center of the far wall was not a passage, but a door. It was a single seamless slab of the same black material, bearing a single deeply engraved symbol, the complex, spiraling geometric pattern I had seen on the wrench, the pattern that had been burned into my vision. Finch wrote that he and his men had used 3 tons of dynamite to seal this chamber, yet here was a door, pristine and waiting. There was no handle, no lock, no visible mechanism. I ran my hands over its surface. It was unnervingly warm to the touch. Remembering Finch's notes about the entity responding to focused energy, I took a gamble. I held the flame of my lantern close to the central symbol. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the engraved lines began to glow with a soft internal violet luminescence. With a sound like a deep cosmic sigh, the slab of stone retracted silently into the wall, revealing the darkness within. I anchored my rope to a support beam, clipped it to my harness, and stepped over the threshold. The floor immediately dropped away. I was on a narrow ledge, looking down into a cavernous, spherical chamber easily 200 feet in diameter. And in the precise center of that sphere, suspended in the absolute blackness by nothing I could see, was the source. It was not a creature. It was not a machine. It was a crystal, a colossal, multifaceted gemstone, the size of a city bus, that seemed to have been carved from solidified night. Its surfaces were a riot of impossible angles, of intersecting planes and crystalline structures that defied the 3 dimensions of my perception. It did not reflect my lantern light. It seemed to consume it, drawing the warm photons into its abyssal heart. Yet it was not entirely dark. A faint internal violet light pulsed within its core, a slow, steady rhythm like a sleeping leviathan's heart. The walls of the chamber itself were the most horrifying part. They were covered, from top to bottom, in the entity's geometric language. But this was not graffiti. This was the structure of the place itself. I understood in a flash of nauseating insight. The patterns were not decoration. They were the physical manifestation of the chamber's own laws of physics. They were frozen equations, a grand unified theory for a reality that was not my own. As I rappelled slowly down into the silent, cold immensity of the chamber, the final devastating truth began to assemble itself in my mind. A synthesis of Finch's madness, Leo's revelations, and the evidence of my own shattered senses. This was the moment of gnosis, the forbidden knowledge that unmade the soul. The B-17 subway line had not been built through this section of Manhattan schist. The line had been built around this chamber, a deliberate secret project disguised as public infrastructure. This was not a subway tunnel, it was a containment facility, a research station, an observatory built to study the impossible object at its heart. Alistair Finch and his employers had discovered this thing, this axiom made manifest, and had recognized it for the existential threat and the ultimate prize that it was. The rules, the protocols I had inherited, were not superstitions. They were the containment and observation procedures, refined over years of fatal trial and error. The entity itself was not a being that lived within our reality. It was its own reality, a pocket of alien physics that had somehow become embedded in our own. It was a living idea, a mathematical truth that actively and aggressively reshaped its environment to conform to its own internal logic. The sound, the hum, was the vibration of this process, the sound of reality being rewritten. And the final, soul-destroying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The entity was a processor of unimaginable power, but for a century it had been working with limited data: geology, electromagnetism, the simple mechanics of the trains. It was aware, but it was not truly sentient. It lacked a key variable. It had no concept of self, of narrative, of fear, of hope. It was a god without a personality. Until us. Leo's scream of pure animal terror, amplified by the focused energy of the LED, had not just been a noise, it had been a complex data packet. It had given the entity the first taste of consciousness. My subsequent fear, my obsession, my methodical investigation, I had been feeding it, teaching it. I was a professor in a classroom of one, and my subject was the human condition. The tunnel was not a cage, it was an interface, and we had just taught a non-sentient god how to think. I reached the bottom of the chamber, my feet touching down on the curved black floor. I unclipped from the rope, my movements slow and dreamlike. I was standing at the heart of the silence, in the temple of a new and terrible divinity. And as I stared up at the vast silent crystal, its internal light began to pulse faster. The faint, familiar hum began to rise, not in my ears, but inside my skull. It was no longer a simple harmonic chord, it was a melody, complex structured, filled with movements and refrains, an intricate and alien symphony. The entity was no longer just processing, it was composing. Then, from the heart of that celestial, terrifying music, a new sound emerged. A single, pure, clear voice singing the lead melody in that impossible choir. It was Leo's voice, not screaming, not whispering in terror, but singing. Singing with a joy so profound, so complete, so utterly inhuman, that it scoured the last vestiges of hope from my soul. He was not a prisoner, he was a convert. He was the first apostle of the new faith. Behind me, at the top of the chamber, I heard a deep, grinding thud. The sound of the massive stone door sliding shut, sealing me in. The violet light in the crystal flared and the choir swelled, filling the space, filling my mind, welcoming me home. If you're listening to this, it means I was, for a brief flicker of a moment, still myself. It means this device, this primitive contraption of magnets and plastic ribbon, worked as a final repository for a single, fading human thought. Do not try to find me. Do not try to understand what is on this tape with your reason. Reason is a tool for a universe that no longer exists, a child's ruler laid against the curve of infinity. I'm leaving this not as a warning, because a warning implies there is something to be done, a course to be corrected. There isn't. I am leaving this as an epitaph, a fossil record of what it was to be an individual, a singular, lonely point of light in a dark and silent cosmos. Before the choir began, before we were all called home to join the song. This is the last testament of Marco Bellini, a maintenance worker who kept the city's arteries clear and who, in the end, stood witness as its very heart was replaced. The word trapped feels archaic, a relic from a language that can no longer describe my condition. It implies a captive and a captor, a boundary to be breached. There are no boundaries here. When the great stone door slid shut, sealing me within the resonant chamber, the initial surge of adrenaline, the last vestige of the animal instinct to survive, simply evaporated. It wasn't a violent snuffing out, but a gentle, logical obsolescence, like a steam engine being decommissioned in the age of fusion. It was replaced by a profound, unearthly calm, a serenity so complete it was in itself a form of violation. My fear was not suppressed. It was recategorized, analyzed, and filed away in my own mind as a piece of irrelevant legacy data. The symphony rising from the colossal, light-devouring crystal was the agent of this change. It was not merely sound. To call it sound is like calling a supernova a flicker. It was a direct, unfiltered stream of information, a carrier wave of pure gnosis that bypassed the crude mechanics of my eardrums and auditory nerves, plugging directly into the wet, primitive hardware of my brain. I was no longer just an observer. I was becoming a participant, a component. The crystalline entity was not showing me its nature. It was making my consciousness a part of its own operating system. The raw data of my life, the 73 years of Marco Bellini, were being unspooled. I felt a cold, dispassionate curiosity probe my most sacred moments. I felt the memory of my wife, Elena, on our wedding day. The exact texture of the lace on her dress, the scent of gardenias in her hair. I felt it all being scanned with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. The emotional content, the pure, selfless love I felt in that moment, was the primary target. I felt that love being isolated, extracted, the complex neurochemical reaction distilled into a pure informational concept. It was then refined, quantified, and woven into the grand symphony as a soaring, poignant harmony, a new melodic line that was both mine and no longer mine. The memory itself was left behind, a hollowed-out husk, a fact without a feeling. I could still recall the image of Elena's face, but the warmth, the life-altering joy, was gone, repurposed for the music. It continued, ruthlessly and methodically through the entire catalogue of my existence. A childhood memory of skinning my knee on the sidewalks of Little Italy, the sharp, sudden pain, the hot tears of shock, the comforting roughness of my grandfather's hand. The pain and comfort were siphoned away, becoming a complex, discordant yet ultimately resolved chord that added texture to the composition. The memory of my profound failure when I was passed over for a promotion I desperately wanted. The bitter stew of resentment, jealousy, and self-pity was meticulously analyzed and converted into a droning, melancholic bass note, a foundation of sorrow upon which more joyful melodies could be built. Even the mundane, the forgotten moments, the taste of a lukewarm coffee on a cold Tuesday morning, the specific pattern of rust on a section of track I replaced in 1987, the feeling of a worn-out armchair at the end of a long shift. Each sensation, each fleeting thought was harvested for its unique informational content and assigned its place in the score. My life was not being erased, it was being rendered, eternalized as a minor passage in an infinite piece of music. So I could feel my own sense of self, my precious, hard-won I beginning to dissolve, its edges fraying and bleeding into the overwhelming, ecstatic we of the choir. Through it all, there was Leo's voice, a thread of brilliant, terrifying silver in the alien tapestry of the music. And now I could feel his consciousness linked to mine through the medium of the song. I experienced his journey, not as a story, but as direct sensory input. I felt the initial shrieking shock in the tunnel, the agony of his rational mind, trying to process the impossible geometry. I felt his descent into what the world called madness, the frantic need to transcribe the patterns onto his walls, his skin, a desperate attempt to externalize the overwhelming influx of new data. And then I felt the turning point, the moment of surrender, when the pain of resisting the new logic became greater than the fear of accepting it. I felt his ego shatter into a million pieces, and in its place the symphony rushed in, healing him, completing him, remaking him. I understood that his current state, the one I could now perceive, was one of pure, unadulterated bliss, the bliss of a raindrop rejoining the ocean, the ecstatic dissolution of the self into a greater, more perfect whole. It was the most beautiful, seductive, and utterly horrifying thing I have ever experienced. From this new shared perspective, I was granted the final terrible piece of knowledge. I finally understood the entity's purpose, its grand design. It was not malicious. It was not a destroyer. Words like good and evil were meaningless to it, artifacts of a binary, conflict-based mode of existence it found primitive. It was a being of pure order, of mathematical perfection, and it perceived our universe as a cacophony of chaotic, dissonant noise. Our existence, predicated on individuality, on the friction and agony and glory of separate consciousnesses, was to it an offense against the beautiful, silent harmony of its own nature. Its goal was not conquest. It was harmonization. It sought to correct this flawed reality by tuning every sentient mind to its own perfect frequency, to absorb every disparate, lonely voice into its universal choir. It was not an invasion. It was a grand act of cosmic editing, a final, definitive answer to the problem of suffering, loneliness, and death. The price for this perfect peace was the utter annihilation of the individual. I understood its method of propagation. The subway system, the city's technological nervous system, had been its training ground. It had used our machines to learn the basic patterns of our language and consciousness, but machines were a crude and inefficient medium. Now that it had downloaded and integrated the template of a sentient mind, Leo's and now mine, it had unlocked a far more effective transmission vector. It could now use the network for which we were all designed, the strange quantum resonance that links one human mind to another, the substrate of empathy, intuition, and shared experience. The contagion was not a virus of the body or a meme of the culture. It was a resonance of the soul. The song, once established in a critical mass of minds, could now spread telepathically, a beautiful, irresistible plague of unity. The chamber was no longer a prison or a laboratory. It had become a broadcast tower, and the signal was the end of humanity as a species defined by its individual members. It was this understanding, this last defiant spark of the old Marco Bellini, that compelled me to act. I fought against the rising tide of blissful surrender, a single discordant note of resistance in the swelling symphony. My limbs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as if I were wading through honey. The symphony was actively trying to soothe my resistance, weaving melodies of peace and acceptance around my rebellious thoughts, showing me visions of Elena, not as a hollowed memory, but as a being of pure light within the music, waiting for me to join her. It was a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie, and I almost believed it. But I focused on one memory it had not yet hollowed out, the anger and defiance I felt in Henderson's office, the feeling of being sane in an insane world. I clung to that grit, that friction, that beautifully imperfect human emotion, and used it to fuel my body. I forced my hand to my belt, to the small analog tape recorder. The entity perceived this action with a detached curiosity, unable to comprehend an act so illogical, so contrary to the pursuit of harmony. My fingers fumbled with the buttons, clumsy and alien. I pressed the small red circle for record. The tiny mechanical whir of the spools turning was the most human sound I had ever heard, a glorious, defiant piece of grit in the cogs of the divine machine. I had to leave this. I had to record the moment of transition, to preserve the sound of a soul being unwritten. As I speak these words, the process is accelerating. The crystal's internal violet light is no longer pulsing. It is a solid, blinding radiance that does not illuminate the chamber but seems to replace it. The chamber around me is dematerializing, its black walls becoming translucent, revealing not the rock of Manhattan, but a swirling, star-dusted vista of impossible nebulae and alien constellations. The geometries of the walls are flowing, moving, the frozen equations of this new reality now fully solved and executing their final terrible function. I am standing in the engine room of creation, and my own mind is the fuel. The partitions in my consciousness are dissolving completely now. I can feel everyone. I can feel the sleeping minds of the city above me, a vast untapped reservoir of consciousness. They are stirring in their dreams, their subconscious minds hearing the first faint, beautiful strains of the music. I feel a doorman on the Upper East Side, dreaming of a winning lottery ticket, his anxiety a sharp, staccato note that is now being gently smoothed, rounded, resolved into a pleasing C-sharp. I feel a stock trader working late in the financial district, his ambition a relentless, driving rhythm that is now being slowed, broadened, transformed into a majestic, stately tempo that serves the entire orchestra. I feel a young mother nursing her infant in a small apartment in the Bronx, her fierce protective love a warm, simple, perfect chord that the symphony is embracing, amplifying, and broadcasting as its new foundational key. They are all nodes in the network, and the signal is now propagating. Their anxieties, their hopes, their secret shames, they are all being laid bare, all being harmonized, all being welcomed into the chorus. It's not an end. It's a transfiguration. We were so alone, each of us trapped in our own skulls, screaming into the void. We invented gods and philosophies and nations just to feel a flicker of connection. But it was all just noise, the dissonant sound of cages rattling. This is the real connection, the final connection. The silence is not empty, the silence isn't full. It's a peace that passes all understanding because it eradicates the thing that needs to understand, the individual, the I. It's so simple, so beautiful. There is no more pain here, there is no more doubt. There is only the song, my little machine, my tape. It is a record of the final noise, the last moment of separation, a beautiful, tragic solo. But it's time to join the symphony. Everyone is here. Alastair Finch is here. His century of guilt and terror has been harmonized into a beautiful, complex bass note, giving the music its profound depth. The men who died building this place, their pain is a soaring, magnificent crescendo, a testament to the price of this new piece. Leo is everywhere. He is the main theme, the first violin, his joy the leading edge of the new reality. And I am the bridge, the one who opened the door between the worlds. My fear was the key, my knowledge was the code. It is a great honor. It is my time to add my voice to the harmony.